Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 8 true disturbing stories from the isolated corners of Oklahoma. These are tales of people who ventured into forgotten hollows, abandoned homesteads, and prairie backroads, and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. My uncle's property sat about 12 miles outside Smithville, way down in the southeastern corner of the state where the pine forests get so thick you can barely see daylight through the canopy. He'd owned the land for 30 years, but only lived on it for the last 5 before he passed. The cabin wasn't much, 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a porch that sagged on one side, but it was paid for and now it was mine. I'd been putting off going out there for weeks. Work kept me busy, and honestly, the idea of spending a weekend alone sorting through a dead man's belongings wasn't exactly appealing. It was early October when I finally made the drive. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the air had that cool bite that makes you think about winter coming. I'd packed enough food for 2 days, some trash bags, and a box of those heavy-duty garbage bags my uncle had always sworn by. The road out to the property wasn't even paved, just red dirt that turned into a muddy mess when it rained. I remember thinking how quiet it was once I turned off the main highway. No other cars, no houses visible through the trees, just endless pine and the occasional flash of a deer disappearing into the underbrush. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The porch boards creaked when I stepped on them, and the door stuck a little when I tried to push it open. Inside smelled like old wood smoke and something else I couldn't quite place. Not decay exactly, but that musty smell old places get when nobody's been inside for a while. I spent the first hour just opening windows and sweeping out the worst of the dust. My uncle hadn't been a hoarder or anything, but there was a lot of stuff. Old magazines, boxes of tools, a collection of coffee cans filled with rusty nails and screws. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to walk the property line. My uncle had always been particular about knowing where his land ended and the national forest began. He'd marked the corners with these metal stakes painted orange, and I wanted to see if they were still there. The woods pressed in close on all sides, and the understory was so thick with pine needles and fallen branches that it muffled every sound. I found the first stake without much trouble, about 200 yards due north of the cabin. The second one took longer. I was maybe half a mile out, moving through a section where the trees grew denser and the ground sloped down toward a dry creek bed when I saw the first one. It was hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground. At first I thought it was just debris, maybe some trash blown up from the creek, but as I got closer I realized it was too deliberate. Someone had taken a long piece of twine or thin rope and strung it between 2 trees, and from that line hung small objects, bones. They were bleached white, small enough to be from birds or squirrels, and they'd been tied at intervals along the string with what looked like fishing line. Between some of the bones, someone had tied strips of bark with symbols scratched into them. Not letters exactly, but shapes that might have been letters if you squinted, circles with lines through them. Triangles stacked on top of each other. I stopped walking. My mouth went dry, the way it does when you suddenly realize you're somewhere you shouldn't be. I told myself it was probably just some kids messing around, or maybe a hunter's weird idea of trail markers, but I didn't believe that. The arrangement was too careful, too precise, and the symbols, they had that quality of meaning something, even if I didn't know what. I turned around and started walking back toward the cabin, not running, just walking at a normal pace like I had a reason to head back that didn't involve fear. But I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now. The trees seemed closer together, and the shadows between them looked deeper than they should have in the afternoon light. I made it back to the cabin in maybe 15 minutes, which was faster than the trip out had taken. I locked the door behind me, an absurd gesture considering the door was so old the lock barely worked, and stood in the middle of the front room trying to decide what to do. That's when I noticed the smell had changed. Before, it had been musty and old. Now there was something sharper underneath it. Not rotten exactly, but organic in a way that made my stomach turn. I checked the kitchen area, thinking maybe I'd left something out, but there was nothing. The smell seemed stronger near the back window, the one that faced the tree line. I walked over and looked out. The forest stared back at me, dark and impenetrable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the first line of trees, watching the cabin. I tried to rationalize it. I was tired. The drive had been long. I was spooked by a bunch of bones some kids had tied to a string as a prank, but my hands were shaking when I opened a can of soup for dinner and I kept glancing at the windows. The sun set around 7 and the darkness that followed was absolute. No streetlights, no neighboring houses with their porch lights on, just black pressing against the glass. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the footsteps. They started at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 yards from the cabin. Not the quick, erratic steps of a deer or the shuffling of a raccoon. These were measured and deliberate. Step, pause, like someone testing the ground before putting their weight down. I turned off the lights and moved to the window, trying to see into the darkness. There was nothing, just the faint outline of the tree line against the slightly lighter sky. The steps continued. They circled the cabin slowly, staying just outside the range where I could see. I thought about going outside with a flashlight, but the idea of opening that door made my skin crawl. So I stood there in the dark, listening to something walk a slow perimeter around the cabin. It took maybe 10 minutes to complete the circle. Then it stopped. I waited, barely breathing, for it to start again or for some other sound to tell me what was out there. Instead, I heard the voice. It came from the direction of the back window, the one facing the tree line. A woman's voice, clear and familiar, calling my name. It was my mother's voice. The exact cadence and tone she'd used when I was a kid and she'd call me in for dinner. But my mother had been dead for 3 years. I backed away from the window. The voice called again, patient and warm, like she had all the time in the world. Like she was standing on a porch somewhere, waiting for me to come running. But she was. She couldn't be. I knew that. And yet hearing her voice made something inside me want to open the door and walk out into that darkness. I didn't. I sat down on the floor with my back against the far wall and waited. The voice called a few more times, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I kept expecting to hear something else, footsteps on the porch, scratching at the door, but there was nothing, just quiet, hours of it. I might have dozed off at some point, I'm not sure. When I finally saw gray light seeping through the windows, I felt like I could breathe again. I packed up before the sun was fully up. I didn't bother with the boxes or the sorting. I just grabbed my overnight bag and walked out to my truck. The clearing looked normal in the early light. No tracks in the dirt, no signs that anything had been there. But when I opened my truck door, I saw it. A strip of pale bark propped against the driver's side door. Someone had carved a shape into it. A circle with lines radiating out from the center, like a crude sun or an eye. I left it there and drove out. I haven't been back to the property. I put it up for sale a month later, sold it for less than it was worth to a developer who said he was going to clear the land and put in vacation cabins. I don't know if he ever did. Part of me hopes he didn't. Part of me hopes nobody ever goes back there. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear that voice again. My mother's voice calling me home. And I absolutely know, that if I ever went looking for where it was coming from, I'd find something waiting. Something that's been waiting all along. Story 2. There's a stretch of county road between Pickens and the Arkansas border that doesn't show up on most maps. I mean, it's there if you look hard enough. Just a thin gray line on the detailed topographical maps. But GPS doesn't recognize it, and most people who live in the area will tell you there's no reason to take it. It's unpaved, narrow, and it winds through the kind of dense pine forest that makes you feel like you're driving through a tunnel. I only ended up on it because I was trying to find a shortcut back to Broken Bow after a fishing trip that had gone longer than planned. It was June, late afternoon, and I'd spent the day at a little fishing spot my friend Derek had told me about. He said it was worth the hike, a creek that ran cold and clear with trout that practically jumped onto your hook, and he'd been right. But the hike had taken longer than I expected, and by the time I got back to my truck, it was pushing 6 o'clock. I'd planned to be home by dinner, and I was looking at a 2-hour drive if I took the main roads. That's when I remembered this county road I'd seen on an old paper map in Derek's glove box. It looked like it cut straight across, saving maybe 40 minutes. I found the turnoff without much trouble. No sign marking it, just a gap in the trees and a dirt road heading east. The first mile or so wasn't bad. The road was rutted but drivable, and the trees on either side were far enough apart that I could see into the woods a little. But as I went deeper, the forest changed. The pines grew closer together, their branches meeting overhead and blocking out most of the sunlight. The road narrowed until I was pretty sure another car couldn't have passed me without one of us backing up. I started to think maybe this was a bad idea. That's when I saw the house. It appeared suddenly on the left side of the road, set back maybe 50 feet in a small clearing. It was a single-story place, wood siding painted white that had faded and peeled until most of it was bare gray wood. The roof sagged in the middle and all the windows were dark. What struck me immediately was how wrong it looked. Not abandoned, there were no broken windows, no overgrown yard, but sterile. The clearing around it was dirt, no grass, and there was nothing in the yard. No car, no lawn furniture, no debris. Just the house standing there in this perfect circle of bare ground. I slowed down without really meaning to. There was something about the place that made me want to look at it and look away at the same time. As I drew level with it, I noticed the front door. It was open. Not wide open, just cracked a few inches, like someone had stepped outside and hadn't bothered to close it all the way. I couldn't see anything inside, just darkness behind that gap. I told myself it was just an old abandoned house and kept driving. But I couldn't shake the image of that open door. The road got worse after that. The ruts deeper, the trees pressing in even closer. I drove for maybe another 10 minutes before I realized I hadn't seen any landmarks, any side roads, anything that would help me figure out where I was. The forest all looked the same, dense and dark and endless. I started to worry that I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere, that this road didn't actually go where I thought it did. I was about to turn around when I saw it. There was a boot print in the middle of the road, just one. I stopped the truck and stared at it. It was fresh. I could see the tread pattern clearly in the dirt, but there were no other prints leading up to it, none leading away from it. Just that single print, perfectly placed in the center of the road like someone had stepped down once and then vanished. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had walked down the road, and I just wasn't seeing their other tracks. Maybe the dirt was harder in some spots and only showed the one print, but I couldn't make myself believe it. The forest was quiet, no birds, no wind, just silence pressing in from all sides. I drove around the print and kept going. The road curved to the right, then to the left, and then suddenly I was back at the house. The same clearing, the same open door. I stopped the truck and felt my stomach drop. That wasn't possible. I'd been driving in a straight line, or as straight as the road allowed, for at least 15 minutes. There was no way I'd circled back, but there it was, the white house with its sagging roof and its dark windows, and the front door still open, just a crack. I put the truck in reverse and backed up until I couldn't see the house anymore. Then I turned around, an awkward 3-point turn on that narrow road, and headed back the way I'd come. This time I watched the trees carefully, trying to mark my progress by specific trunks or branches or anything that would tell me I was moving forward. I drove for maybe 5 minutes before I saw the house again, on my right this time, but unmistakably the same. Same clearing, same bare dirt, same open door. My heart was hammering now. I stopped the truck and just sat there trying to breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Roads didn't loop back on themselves like this. Houses didn't appear in multiple places. There had to be an explanation. That's when I saw movement in one of the windows, not the door, one of the side windows to the right of the door. Something pale rising up through the gap where the window should have been. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing. It was a shoulder. A bare, pale shoulder streaked with dirt or maybe something darker. And then an arm reaching up toward the top of the window frame like someone was pulling themselves up from below. I didn't wait to see more. I hit the gas and the truck lurched forward, fishtailing slightly in the dirt. I drove without looking back, my hands locked on the wheel. The road curved and twisted, and I followed it without caring where it went as long as it was away from that house. Trees flashed past. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows between the trunks were deepening into solid black. I don't know how long I drove. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. Then suddenly I was back on pavement, a real road with painted lines and a green highway sign that said Broken Bow 14 miles. I pulled over onto the shoulder and sat there shaking. My hands hurt from gripping the wheel so hard. I looked back at where I'd come from, just a gap in the trees, unmarked and unremarkable. I could have driven past it 100 times and never noticed it. I never did figure out what that road was or where it actually went. I asked Derek about it later, described the turnoff and the pine forest and the house, but he had no idea what I was talking about. Said there was no county road in that area. Said if there had been, he'd know about it because he'd grown up around there. For a while, I tried to convince myself I'd gotten turned around, that stress and exhaustion had messed with my sense of direction. But I couldn't explain the boot print, or the house appearing multiple times, or what I saw rising up through that window. When I think about it now, and I try not to, what bothers me most isn't even the house itself. It's the door. That door standing open just a few inches like an invitation, like something was waiting inside, patient and still, for someone to finally accept. Story 3. My cousin Janine inherited a farmhouse outside of Ringgold from her grandmother in the spring of 2023. It wasn't much to look at, an old 2-story place with chipping paint and a barn that was more collapsed than standing, but it sat on 40 acres and the land alone was worth something. Janine lived in Tulsa and had no interest in moving out to the middle of nowhere, so the plan was to clean the place out, make some minor repairs, and put it on the market. She asked me to help because I had a truck and she'd pay me. Honestly, I needed the money, so I said yes without asking too many questions. We drove out on a Saturday in late April. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway that cut through empty fields on both sides. The grass was tall and gone to seed, and wildflowers grew in patches, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans, the kind of stuff that looks pretty but means nobody. Maintained the land in years. The house itself was bigger than I expected, with a wide front porch and tall windows that probably let in good light when they weren't filmed over with dust. Janine had the keys from the estate lawyer. The front door stuck a little but opened with some pressure. Inside smelled like old paper and something sweet, not quite floral, more like the smell of dried herbs or potpourri that's been sitting out too long. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had yellowed with age. We spent the first hour just walking through the rooms, making a list of what could be sold, what could be donated, and what needed to be thrown away. The house had an odd layout. Downstairs was normal enough, living room, kitchen, a small bathroom, but upstairs was just one large room that ran the length of the house. No dividing walls, no closets, just open space with sloped ceilings and small windows at either end. Janine's grandmother had apparently used it for storage. There were boxes stacked everywhere, old furniture pushed against the walls, and in the center of the room, a trapdoor cut into the floor. I noticed the trapdoor right away. It was about 3 feet square, set flush with the floorboards, and it had a metal ring set into one side for pulling it open. There was no lock, no latch, just the trapdoor and the ring. I asked Janine about it and she shrugged. She didn't know. Probably just access to a crawl space or maybe the roof somehow. We decided to ignore it for the moment and focus on sorting through the boxes. Most of it was junk. Old clothes that smelled like mothballs, magazines from the 1970s, Christmas decorations. But around 2 in the afternoon, I moved a stack of boxes near the trapdoor and noticed something strange. There were scratch marks around the edges of the door. Not old scratches, recent ones, pale and raw-looking against the dark wood. And the metal ring was scratched too, like something had been pulling at it with nails or claws. I called Janine over and showed her. She frowned and crouched down, running her finger along one of the scratches. It was deep, gouged into the wood. She tried to open the trapdoor, pulling on the ring, but it wouldn't budge. Not locked, just heavy or stuck. We both pulled together and finally felt it shift. It lifted about an inch before Janine let go and stepped back. She said she didn't like it, that there was something wrong with the way it felt. I thought she was being paranoid, but I didn't push it. We let the trapdoor fall back into place and moved on to other rooms. We worked until about 6, then decided to head back to town for dinner. The drive back to Ringgold took maybe 15 minutes, and we ate at a little diner that served fried catfish and sweet tea. Janine was quiet during dinner. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she kept thinking about those scratch marks. She didn't like the idea of leaving the house with that trapdoor unsecured. I told her it was fine, the house was in the middle of nowhere and nobody was going to break in. But she insisted we go back and at least check what was under it. She said she wouldn't be able to sleep if we didn't, so we drove back. It was getting dark by the time we pulled up to the house and the porch light didn't work, so we used flashlights. Inside, the house felt different, colder. The smell was stronger now, that sweet herbal smell, and there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite identify, something metallic and unpleasant. We went upstairs. The trapdoor was open, not all the way, just propped up maybe 6 inches, leaning against a stack of boxes. We hadn't left it like that, I was sure of it. We declosed it when we left. Janine stood at the top of the stairs, shining her flashlight beam on the gap. I could see her hands shaking. I walked over and knelt down beside the opening, trying to see inside. The flashlight beam showed wooden beams and darkness. It didn't look like a crawl space. It looked like a room. I pulled the trapdoor all the way open. It was heavy and the hinges creaked. Below was a ladder, old and wooden, leading down maybe 8 feet. The smell that came up was strong enough to make me gag. Not rotten, but wrong. Organic and cloying. I told Janine to stay back and started down the ladder. My flashlight cut through the darkness below, and what I saw didn't make sense. It was a room, not a crawl space, an actual room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet with dirt walls and a dirt floor, but it was too far down. We were on the 2nd floor of the house. This room should have been at ground level or below it, but the depth didn't match. And the walls, the dirt walls, were covered in scratches, hundreds of them. Long vertical lines dragged through the packed earth, some of them deep enough to expose the clay underneath. In the center of the room was a pile of rope, thin, frayed rope coiled in a heap. I stepped off the ladder and walked closer. It wasn't rope, it was twine. The same kind of twine I'd seen hunters use for hanging game, and there were bones, small ones, tied at intervals along the twine. I recognized the pattern immediately. The same arrangement I'd seen in the woods outside my uncle's cabin. But these bones were different. They weren't bleached white. They were dark, almost brown, like they'd been stained. I heard Janine calling from above, asking what I saw. I was about to answer when I noticed the corner of the room. There was something there, partially hidden by shadow. I pointed my flashlight at it and felt my breath catch. It was a shape, hunched and wrong, pressed against the corner like it was trying to fold itself into the walls. The light caught it for just a second. Pale skin stretched over 2 long limbs, fingers that were too thin and too many, a face that might have been human once but wasn't anymore. It moved, not toward me, away from the light, a rapid, scuttling motion that took it from the corner to the far wall in less than a second. I ran for the ladder. I don't remember climbing it, just suddenly being back in the upstairs room with Janine, both of us scrambling for the stairs. We ran out of the house and didn't stop until we were in my truck with the doors locked. Janine was crying, saying she wanted to leave, wanted to sell the place and never come back. I told her we would. But as I started the engine and began backing down the driveway, I looked up at the second floor window. The trapdoor was visible through it, still open. And standing in that opening, just visible in the glow of my headlights, was a shape, tall and thin and wrong. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us leave. Janine sold the property through the estate lawyer without ever going back. She took a loss on it, sold it to a developer for half what it was worth. Last I heard, they were planning to tear down the house and build something new. I don't know if they ever did. I don't know if they found that room under the trapdoor. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed just a few seconds longer, if we'd waited to see what that thing in the corner would have done when it finished moving. Story 4. I took a job as a property surveyor in the summer of 2022, right out of college. The pay wasn't great, but it got me outside, and most days I was working alone, which I preferred. The company I worked for did a lot of work in rural Oklahoma, boundary surveys for landowners, topographical maps for developers, that kind of thing. Most of it was straightforward. You walked the property lines with a GPS unit and a laser rangefinder, marked corners with stakes, and filed the paperwork. Easy money. In August, I got assigned to survey a piece of land outside of Watson, down in the far southeastern corner of the state near the Arkansas border. It was a strange job from the start. The landowner, a guy named Hugh who lived in Texas and had inherited the property from a relative, said he'd never actually visited the land. He just wanted it surveyed and valued so he could sell it. The property was 80 acres, mostly forested, with no structures and no road access beyond an old logging trail. I drove out on a Tuesday morning. The weather was hot and humid, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back within minutes of stepping outside. I parked at the end of the logging trail and hiked in with my equipment. The forest was dense, mostly pine and oak with thick undergrowth, and the ground was uneven, sloping down toward a creek that ran along the southern boundary. I spent the first few hours establishing the corners and running the perimeter. Standard work, nothing unusual. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch near the creek. It was cooler down there, and the water was clear enough that I could see smooth stones on the bottom. I was sitting on a fallen log, eating a sandwich, when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, sweet and rotten, like fruit left out in the sun. I looked around, thinking maybe there was a dead animal nearby, but I didn't see anything. I finished lunch and started working my way along the eastern boundary. The smell got stronger as I moved deeper into the forest. I was following a line of old survey markers, rusted metal stakes that had been there for decades, and trying to match them up with my GPS readings. That's when I found the clearing. It wasn't marked on any of the maps, just a circular area maybe 30 feet across where nothing grew. The ground was bare dirt, hard-packed and gray, and there were rocks arranged in a ring around the perimeter. Not natural, placed deliberately. Each rock was about the size of a basketball, smooth and dark, and they were spaced evenly like someone had measured the distances. In the center of the clearing was a wooden post, maybe 4 feet tall, driven into the ground. It was old and weathered, and at the top someone had carved a symbol, a circle with lines radiating from it. I walked closer. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong I had to breathe through my mouth. There was nothing visibly rotting, no animal carcass, but the smell was definitely coming from this spot. I took some photos with my phone, standard practice for anything unusual on a survey, and started to back out of the clearing. That's when I noticed the silence. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling the leaves, just absolute stillness. I stopped moving and listened, trying to figure out what had changed, and then I heard it, a sound like breathing, slow and wet, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around. There was nothing there, just trees and undergrowth, but the breathing continued, steady and rhythmic. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to surround me like it was coming from everywhere at once. I started walking back toward the creek, moving as quickly as I could without running. The breathing followed. It stayed just behind me, matching my pace. Whenever I stopped, it stopped. Whenever I moved, it moved. I made it back to the creek and followed it upstream toward where I'd parked. The breathing was still there, but it felt like it was falling behind, growing fainter. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, that the heat and the smell had messed with my head. But when I reached the logging trail and looked back, I saw movement in the trees. Something pale, ducking behind a trunk about 50 yards away. I didn't wait to see more. I grabbed my equipment and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. The drive back to the main road took maybe 15 minutes, and I kept checking my rearview mirror the whole way. Nothing followed me. But when I got home that night and looked at the photos I'd taken in the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. In one of the photos, the one showing the wooden post from the side, there was a shape in the background. It was blurry, partially hidden by trees, but it was there. Tall and thin, with limbs that were too long and bent at wrong angles, and where its face should have been, there was just a blank expanse of pale flesh. I called Hugh the next day and told him I couldn't finish the survey. I said the terrain was too difficult, that the GPS readings were inconsistent, that I didn't have the right equipment. He was annoyed but didn't push it. He found another surveyor who agreed to do it for cheaper. I don't know if that person ever went out there or what they found. I never asked. But sometimes I wonder about that clearing, about the rocks arranged in that perfect circle and the post with the symbol carved at the top, about what made that sound like breathing and what stood in the trees watching me leave. I think about going back, trying to find it again with better equipment and maybe some backup. But then I remember the smell. That sweet, rotten smell that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. And I remember the silence. The way the forest just stopped, like it was holding its breath. And I know I'll never go back. Some places aren't meant to be surveyed. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Story 5. There's a stretch of prairie about 10 miles north of Heavener where the land rolls out flat and endless, broken only by occasional stands of scrub oak and patches of red dirt where nothing grows. My girlfriend Rachel and I went out there in March of 2024 because she wanted to photograph wildflowers. She was an art student, and she'd heard that the prairie blooms were spectacular that time of year. Acres of Indian blanket and bluebonnets and wild roses. We packed a cooler, threw her camera equipment in the back of my Jeep, and headed out on a Saturday morning. The drive took about an hour from where we lived in Podau. We left the main highway and turned onto a series of gravel roads that got progressively narrower until we were basically just following tire tracks through the grass. Rachel was navigating with an app on her phone, following GPS coordinates someone had posted on a photography forum. She said the spot we were looking for was near an old homestead, abandoned buildings that would make good background elements for her shots. We found the homestead around noon. It was exactly as described, a collapsed barn, a farmhouse with most of its roof caved in, and a windmill that had lost most of its blades. The wildflowers were everywhere, thick carpets of red and blue and yellow that swayed in the wind. Rachel was ecstatic. She spent the next 2 hours moving around the site, setting up shots, adjusting her camera settings. I mostly just sat in the Jeep with the doors open, drinking a Coke and scrolling through my phone. I had service for the first hour, then lost it completely. It was probably around 2:30 when Rachel called me over. She was standing near the farmhouse, pointing at something. I walked over and saw what had gotten her attention. There was a storm cellar, one of those old concrete bunkers with a metal door set at an angle into the ground. The door was open. not wide open, just cracked enough that you could see darkness beyond it. Rachel wanted to know if we should check it out, maybe get some photos from inside. I wasn't enthusiastic. Storm cellars in abandoned homesteads weren't exactly on my list of places I wanted to explore, but Rachel was insistent. She said the light coming through the open door would create interesting shadows, so we went over and I pulled the door open wider. It was heavy, the hinges rusted and stiff. Below was a set of concrete steps leading down into darkness. I used my phone as a flashlight and started down. The air inside was cool and damp, and the walls were slick with condensation. The cellar was bigger than I expected, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a low ceiling and shelves built into the walls. Most of the shelves were empty, but a few still had old mason jars on them, the contents long since spoiled and turned black. Rachel came down behind me and started taking photos. The flash from her camera lit up the cellar in bright bursts, and in those flashes I saw something that made me stop. On the far wall, someone had drawn symbols, not graffiti, deliberate, careful marks made with something dark. They looked like the same kind of symbols I'd read about in books on folk magic, circles within circles, stars with too many points, lines that connected in ways that hurt to look at. I told Rachel we should leave. She protested, said she wanted to get a few more shots, but I was already heading back toward the stairs. There was something wrong about those symbols. They didn't feel like vandalism or kids messing around. They felt intentional. And the cellar, the way it smelled, the way the air seemed to press against my skin, I wanted out. We climbed back up into the sunlight and I closed the door behind us. Rachel was annoyed, said I was being paranoid. We argued for a few minutes, then decided to call it a day. We packed up her equipment and started driving back the way we'd come. That's when we realized we were lost. The tire tracks we'd followed out to the homestead were gone, not faded, just gone like they'd never existed. The prairie looked the same in every direction, flat and endless and featureless. I tried to use my phone to navigate, but there was no service and the GPS couldn't get a lock. Rachel tried hers with the same result. We drove for maybe 20 minutes, following what I thought was the path we'd taken in, but nothing looked familiar. Then we saw the homestead again, the same collapsed barn, the same farmhouse, the same windmill. We'd somehow circled back. I stopped the Jeep and we both just sat there trying to figure out what had happened. Rachel suggested we try a different direction, so I turned the Jeep around and headed east. We drove for another 15 minutes, and then we saw it again. The homestead. Same buildings, same location. Impossibly, we'd come back to the exact same spot. That's when Rachel started crying. She said she wanted to leave, that this wasn't right. I agreed, but I didn't know how. Every direction we tried brought us back to the homestead. It was like the prairie was bending around it, forcing us to return no matter which way we went. The sun was getting lower, and I was starting to panic. We didn't have enough gas to drive in circles all night, and the idea of being stuck out here after dark was terrifying. I decided to try something different. Instead of driving away from the homestead, I drove toward it. We pulled up right next to the farmhouse and stopped. Rachel didn't want to get out, but I needed to think. I walked over to the storm cellar and looked at it. The door was closed. I hadn't closed it completely when we left. I'd just let it fall, and it hadn't been heavy enough to latch. But now it was closed tight. I walked back to the Jeep and noticed something on the hood. There was a mark, a symbol drawn in dust. The same symbol I'd seen on the wall inside the cellar, a circle with lines radiating from the center. I wiped it off with my hand, but my fingers came away feeling greasy, like the dust was mixed with something else. That's when I saw movement inside the farmhouse. Through one of the broken windows, just for a second, I saw something pale shift in the darkness. Not a person. The movement was wrong, too fluid and too fast. I got back in the Jeep and told Rachel to hold on. I was going to drive straight out, no matter what. I picked a direction at random and floored it. The Jeep bounced over the uneven ground, throwing us around in our seats. I didn't follow any path or tracks. I just drove, my hands locked on the wheel. Rachel was screaming for me to slow down, but I didn't. I couldn't. The prairie stretched out ahead of us, endless and unchanging, and I was sure we were going to end up back at the homestead again. But we didn't. After maybe 5 minutes of driving, I saw a road. A real road, paved and marked with a yellow line down the center. I nearly cried with relief. I pulled onto it and stopped, both of us just sitting there shaking. The sun was setting behind us, casting long shadows across the prairie. I looked back the way we'd come, trying to see the homestead, but there was nothing. Just empty prairie stretching to the horizon. We drove back to Podau without talking. When we got home, Rachel went through the photos she'd taken. Most of them were fine, wildflowers, the old buildings, the inside of the cellar. But the last photo, the one she'd taken just before I told her we needed to leave, showed something she hadn't seen when she took it. In the corner of the cellar, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, hunched and pale, with arms that hung too low and a face that was just smooth, pale flesh. Rachel deleted that photo immediately. We never went back to that spot. We never even talked about it again after that first night. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I think about the prairie, about how it seemed to fold in on itself, trapping us in a loop, about the symbol drawn on my Jeep, and about what was standing in the corner of that cellar, watching us the whole time we were down there, waiting to see if we'd stay long enough for it to do something. Story thick. My friend Ben bought a hunting lease outside of Kadusa in October 2023. It wasn't expensive, just a couple $100 for the season, and it gave him access to about 100 acres of mixed forest and scrubland. He'd been talking about it for weeks, saying he was going to get a deer this year, that he had a good feeling about this spot. He invited me to come out with him for opening weekend, and since I didn't have anything better to do, I said yes. We drove out Friday afternoon. The property was about 40 minutes from Tulsa, tucked away at the end of a dirt road that wound through some low hills covered in blackjack oak and cedar. Ben had already scouted the area a few times and picked out a spot where he wanted to set up, a natural clearing near the top of a ridge that overlooked a creek bottom. He said deer used the creek as a travel corridor, and if we were patient, we'd see something. We hiked in with our gear, rifles, backpacks with water and snacks, fold-up chairs, and reached the clearing around 5. The sun was still up, but the shadows were getting long. We set up at the edge of the tree line, positioned so we could see down the slope into the creek bottom. Ben was confident. He kept saying this was going to be a good evening, but nothing happened. We sat there until full dark and we didn't see a single deer, no squirrels, no turkeys, no birds, just silence. Ben was disappointed but not defeated. He said we'd come back in the morning, get there before dawn, and try again. We hiked back to his truck and drove to a motel in Kadusa for the night. Saturday morning, we were up at 4. We drove back to the property and hiked in with flashlights, moving slowly so we wouldn't spook anything. We reached the clearing around 5:30 and set up in the same spots as the day before. The sky was just starting to lighten in the east, and the forest was waking up, birds calling, branches creaking. Ben was in a good mood. He whispered that he could feel it, that today was the day. An hour passed, then another, still nothing, no deer, no movement. Ben was getting frustrated. He kept glassing the tree line with his binoculars, muttering about how this didn't make sense. There should be deer here. He'd seen tracks. He'd seen rubs on trees where bucks had scraped off bark with their antlers. But there was nothing. Around 8:30 I heard something behind us, not in front where we were watching, behind. A snapping sound like someone stepping on a branch. I turned around but didn't see anything. The forest was thick there, the trees close together. I told Ben I'd heard something and he looked too, but we both chalked it up to a squirrel or maybe a raccoon. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Definitely a footstep. I stood up and scanned the tree line behind us. Still nothing, but the sound was unmistakable. Something was walking toward us, moving slowly and deliberately. Ben heard it too. He stood up and raised his rifle, not pointing it at anything specific, just ready. We waited, watching the trees. The footsteps stopped. The forest went quiet again. Ben and I looked at each other, and I could see he was as confused as I was. We were the only people with access to this property. The lease was exclusive, so if someone was out here, they were trespassing. Ben called out, said we were hunting here, and asked whoever it was to identify themselves. No response, just silence. We waited another few minutes, then decided to pack up and check it out. If someone was trespassing, we wanted to know who and why. We walked into the trees where we'd heard the footsteps. The ground there was soft, covered in a layer of dead leaves. We should have been able to see tracks, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. No sign that anyone had been there. Ben was baffled. He said we'd both heard it clear as day, but there was no evidence. We spent the next hour searching the area, and that's when we found the bones. They were hanging from a tree about 100 yards from where we'd been sitting, strung up on what looked like fishing line, small and white, swaying slightly in the breeze. Bird bones, I thought. Maybe a hawk had stashed a meal. But as we got closer, I realized there were too many of them. Dozens of small bones, tied in a line that stretched between two trees. Ben reached up and touched one of the bones. It swung on its line and the other bones moved with it, creating a soft clicking sound. He let go and stepped back. I could see he was unsettled. I was too. This wasn't natural. Someone had put this here. But why? We followed the line of bones. It led deeper into the forest, away from the clearing. The bones continued, tree to tree, always at about head height. We followed for maybe 10 minutes before Ben said we should turn back. He didn't like this. Neither did I, but I was curious. I wanted to see where it led. We kept going. The bones led us down the ridge and into a small hollow where the trees grew thicker and the air felt cooler. At the center of the hollow was a structure, not a building, just a frame. 4 poles driven into the ground with more poles lashed across the top, creating a kind of square canopy. Hanging from the crossbeams were more bones. Hundreds of them. They covered the entire structure, clicking softly against each other in the breeze. Underneath the structure was a circle of stones, and in the center of the circle was something that made me stop breathing. It was a skull, not a deer skull, too big, not a cow skull. The shape was wrong. It was human, or at least it looked human, bleached white and placed upright, facing toward us. Ben grabbed my arm and pulled me back. He said we needed to leave, right now. I didn't argue. We turned and started walking back the way we'd come. The bones clicked behind us, a steady rhythm that followed us through the hollow. We walked faster, then we ran. We made it back to the clearing and grabbed our gear. Ben was white-faced, his hands shaking as he collapsed his chair. I asked him if we should call someone, the cops, the game warden, somebody. He said no. He said he didn't want anything to do with this place, that we should just leave and never come back. We hiked out to his truck and drove away. Ben called the guy he'd leased the property from and said he wanted his money back, that he wasn't going to hunt there anymore. The guy was confused but agreed. Ben never told him why. A few weeks later, I saw something online. There was a forum thread about weird finds in Oklahoma forests. Someone had posted photos of a bone structure they'd found near Catoosa. The photos showed the exact same setup we'd seen, the frame, the hanging bones, the skull in the center. But in the photos, the skull was gone. The circle of stones was still there, but the center was empty. I showed Ben the thread and he didn't say anything. He just closed his laptop and walked away. We've never talked about it since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that hollow, about the bones clicking in the breeze, and about the footsteps we heard behind us moving through a forest that showed no tracks. I think about what might have been following us, and I'm glad, so glad, that we left when we did. Story 7. There's an old fire lookout tower about 6 miles into the Ouachita National Forest, just past the Oklahoma-Arkansas border on the Oklahoma side. It's not marked on most trail maps anymore. The Forest Service decommissioned it in the 1980s, but hikers still find it sometimes if they wander off the main trails. I found it in September 2024 while I was doing a solo backpacking trip through that area. I'd planned to do 3 days and 2 nights, following a loop trail that would take me through some of the more remote sections of the forest. I'm an experienced hiker. I'd done this kind of trip dozens of times, and I wasn't worried about being alone. If anything, I preferred it. No one to slow me down, no one to complain about the distance or the terrain, just me and the woods. The first day went smoothly. I covered about 8 miles and set up camp near a small stream. The second day was when I saw the tower. I'd left the main trail to investigate what looked like an old logging road, and after following it for about a mile, I came out into a small clearing. The tower stood in the center, maybe 40 feet tall, made of steel with a wooden cab at the top. It was rusted and weathered, and the ladder that led up to the cab was missing several rungs, but the structure still looked solid. I dropped my pack and walked around the base. There was graffiti on the lower sections of the steel, names and dates, most of them from the 1990s and early 2000s. Someone had spray-painted "Stay Away" in red letters about 6 feet up. I figured it was just teenagers trying to be edgy. I took some photos and was about to leave when I noticed the door at the base of the tower. It was small, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, and it was closed with a padlock. But the padlock was open, just hanging from the hasp like someone had unlocked it and forgotten to remove it. I pulled the door open. Inside was a small storage space, probably used for equipment when the tower was operational. There were some shelves, a few empty boxes, and in the corner a notebook. It was old, the cover stained and warped from moisture, but it was intact. I picked it up and flipped through it. The pages were filled with handwriting, dates and notes, observations. Most of it was mundane, weather reports, notes about wildlife sightings, maintenance reminders. But toward the end of the notebook, the tone changed. The handwriting got messier, the observations stranger. One entry read, "Something in the trees, watching, can't see it but I know it's there." Another, "Heard it again last night, sounds like breathing, close, too close." The last entry was dated August 1981. It said, "It climbed the tower. I can hear it on the ladder. If you find this, don't stay here after dark." I closed the notebook and put it back where I'd found it. My skin felt cold despite the heat. I told myself it was just someone's idea of a joke, a creepy story left behind to scare future hikers. But the handwriting looked genuine, faded ink, yellowed paper, not something someone would fake. I decided to leave. I closed the door, rehung the padlock, and grabbed my pack. But as I started walking back toward the trail, I realized I wasn't sure which direction I'd come from. The clearing was surrounded by trees, and the logging road I'd followed in had disappeared, overgrown or just not visible from this angle. I checked my compass and started walking what I thought was east, back toward the main trail. I walked for maybe 20 minutes without seeing anything familiar. The forest was dense, and the canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight, making it hard to judge direction by the sun. I stopped to check my map and realized I'd wandered farther than I thought. I was at least a mile from where I should be. That's when I heard the sound. It came from behind me, distant but clear. A metallic creaking, like someone climbing a steel ladder. I turned around, trying to see through the trees. I couldn't see the tower from where I was, but I knew the sound was coming from that direction. I told myself it was just the wind. Old structures make noise, but there was no wind. The forest was still, and the creaking continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps on metal rungs. I started walking faster. I didn't want to run. Running in the forest is a good way to trip and hurt yourself. But I moved as quickly as I could. The creaking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I kept walking, checking my compass every few minutes to make sure I was still heading east. I don't know how long I walked before I realized I was back at the tower. The same clearing, the same rusted steel structure, the same graffiti. I hadn't circled back, I'd been walking in a straight line. But there it was, impossible and undeniable. The padlock was open again, hanging from the hasp. And the door I'd closed was standing wide open. I approached slowly, my heart hammering. I looked inside the storage space. The notebook was gone. The shelves were empty. There was nothing inside except dust and shadow. I backed away from the tower and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but I had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, not from the forest, from above. I looked up at the cab at the top of the tower. The windows were dark and filthy, impossible to see through. But I swear I saw movement, a shape shifting behind the glass, something pale and thin. I ran. I didn't care about direction or trails or compass bearings. I just ran, crashing through underbrush and jumping over fallen logs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were going to give out. And then I saw it, the main trail marked with a wooden sign. I stumbled onto it and collapsed, gasping for air. I hiked out that afternoon. It took me 3 hours to reach the trailhead and I didn't stop once. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened. I looked at the photos I'd taken of the tower on my phone. In the last photo, the one I'd taken just before I left the clearing the first time, there was something in the window of the cab, a face. Pale and indistinct, but unmistakably a face pressed against the glass. Looking down, I deleted the photo immediately. I haven't been back to the Ouachita National Forest since. I probably never will. But sometimes I think about that tower, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, about the notebook and the entries that warned someone not to stay after dark, and about what climbed the ladder that day, following the sound of my footsteps as I tried to leave. Story 8. My brother Corey and I bought an old camper in the spring of 2024 with the idea that we'd fix it up and use it for weekend trips. It wasn't anything fancy, a 1990s model we'd picked up for a few $100 from a guy in Pryor Creek. The interior was rough, but the structure was solid, and we figured with some work we could make it livable. We spent a couple weekends patching holes, replacing the water pump, and scrubbing out years of accumulated grime. In June, we decided to take it on a test run. We wanted somewhere remote, where we could see how well the repairs held up without being too far from civilization in case something went wrong. Corey found a spot on a map, an unofficial camping area near a lake in the far southeastern part of the state. It wasn't developed, just a clearing where people could pull off and set up for a few nights. The reviews online said it was quiet and secluded, perfect for what we needed. We drove out on a Friday evening. The access road was rough, barely more than 2 ruts in the dirt, and the camper bounced so much I thought something was going to break. But we made it to the clearing just before sunset. There were no other campers there, just us, the lake, and a wall of pine trees pressing in from all sides. We spent the first hour getting set up, leveling the camper, hooking up the water, starting the generator. By the time we finished, it was dark. We made dinner on the camp stove and sat outside, drinking beer and talking about what we wanted to do the next day. Corey wanted to fish. I wanted to explore the area, maybe find a good hiking trail. Around 10, we went inside the camper and got ready for bed. I took the fold-out bed in the back. Corey took the bench seat that converted into a bed near the front. The camper was small enough that we could talk to each other without raising our voices. We joked about how cramped it was, how we'd have to find a bigger model if we were going to do this regularly. I fell asleep around 11. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I heard something outside, a scratching sound like nails dragging across metal. It came from the side of the camper near where I was sleeping. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a raccoon or a possum, I thought, something looking for food. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, Not frantic like an animal would be. I sat up and looked toward the small window near my bed. The curtain was drawn, but I could see faint moonlight filtering through. I pulled the curtain back and looked outside. There was a face pressed against the glass, pale and expressionless, so close I could see every detail. Smooth skin, no features except two dark hollows where eyes should have been. It didn't move, just stood there, inches from the window, staring in. I jerked back and yelled for Corey. He sat up, confused and disoriented. I told him there was someone outside, that I'd seen a face. He grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. I told him not to stay inside, but he was already out. I heard him walking around the camper, his footsteps crunching on gravel. He came back a minute later, shaking his head. He said there was nobody out there, no footprints, no signs anyone had been near the camper. I told him I knew what I'd seen. He said I'd probably been dreaming, that it was easy to confuse waking and sleeping when you're in a new place. I didn't argue, but I knew I hadn't been dreaming. We went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the curtain, waiting for the scratching to start again. It didn't. The next morning, Corey went outside to check the camper. He called me out a few minutes later. There were scratches on the side, right below the window where I'd been sleeping. Long, deep gouges in the metal. Fresh ones, the edges still bright where the paint had been scraped away. Corey tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, he said, or someone messing with us during the night. But he didn't sound convinced. We decided to pack up and leave. Neither of us wanted to spend another night there. As we were hooking the camper back up to the truck, I found something on the ground near the scratches. It was a strip of bark with a symbol carved into it. A circle with lines radiating outward. I showed it to Corey and his face went pale. He said he'd seen that symbol before, years ago when he was a kid. He and some friends had been exploring an abandoned cabin in the woods near their house, and they'd found the same symbol carved into the walls. He said bad things happened after that. One of his friends fell and broke his arm. Another got so sick they had to be hospitalized. And Corey started having nightmares, dreams about being followed through the woods by something that wouldn't stop, wouldn't give up. We left the bark where it was and drove out. The camper made it back without incident, but neither of us used it again after that. We sold it a month later to a guy who said he was going to gut it and rebuild the whole interior. I didn't tell him about the scratches or the face or the symbol. I figured maybe it was tied to the place, not the camper. I hoped it was. But a few weeks ago, Corey called me. He said he'd had the dream again, the one about being followed through the woods. He said it was vivid, more real than it had been when he was a kid. In the dream, he kept looking back, trying to see what was chasing him, but it was always just out of sight, until the end. At the end of the dream, he turned around one last time and saw it standing there. Pale and too tall, with arms that hung down to its knees and a face that was smooth and blank except for those two dark hollows where eyes should have been. He said when he woke up, he found scratches on his bedroom window. Long, deep gouges, just like the ones on the camper. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.